is the realm of uncertainty. 3/4 of the factors on which action in war is based are wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty. A sensitive and discriminating judgment is called for, a skilled intelligence to scent out the truth. And that gentleman is a direct quote from the Prussian officer, military strategist, and writer Karl von Clausewitz. And that is a reference to something he coined, this term that we call the fog of war, which refers to the many difficulties that emerge when you're actually on the battlefield, the uncertainties, the terrain, what the enemy is doing, the inability to focus properly, and it can lead to all sorts of negative outcomes. And the concept of the fog in war since then has spread far and wide to all corners of the world, in the sense that you hear it in video games and film, and you even hear people talk about it casually at times. So I think it's a real thing. But I also think the fog of war can be used metaphorically to describe what we have been undergoing for the past year and perhaps even longer, in the sense that we simply do not have the same sense of certainty we used to even a few years ago when it comes to any number of issues and matters. And it might have been that that was always the case and we were simply deceiving ourselves. Entirely possible. But it seems to me that the past year had shown us very much that the sense-making apparatus, and that's not my term necessarily, but it's a term that gets bandied about quite frequently, the sense-making apparatus that we had has largely collapsed in on itself. And it's impossible to know these days what is actually true and what is not. And you could look at any issue, and you probably could apply this principle to that issue. For example, even the most minuscule of issues. Most recently, I've been talking about, of course, Cyberpunk. Well, is Cyberpunk 2077 a good or a bad game? You wouldn't really know, because you're probably going to hear people who say it's really amazing, but most people are going to say it's really, really terrible. And obviously, when it comes to a game, there's a lot of subjectivity there. But more importantly, we don't really know what's been going on with the current pandemic. All of us are sort of swimming in the dark. And we have arguably good reason not to trust the authorities, but to completely distrust institutions also seems a little bit strange because, frankly speaking, most of us are not virologists or epidemiologists, so what do we really know at the end of the day? What about the U.S. presidential election? Do we actually know all the details that went into it? Well, it seems almost certain that Biden's going to be president now, but who knows really if the entire matter was honest or not. This is something that I find, at least personally, to be very difficult to suss out, and I think this applies to a host of other things. We're very much in a state of a fog of unknowing, not too dissimilar to the fog of war described by Clausewitz. And I think we have no reason to believe this is going to improve. The real question is, how does the fog of war, in this case the fog of unknowing, emerge? What are the factors, the ingredients that go into it? Well, on a battlefield, all sorts of things can contribute to a fog of war. Maybe, for example, the enemy units have altered the terrain. Maybe they've dug ditches that you can't see and they're covered up by leaves. Maybe there are mines on the field that you can't see and they're all hidden. Maybe the original plan for the battle has been impinged upon by the fact that it is raining heavily and the formerly solid terrain has now turned muddy and wet, which could lead to all sorts of accidents and problems. So there are all kinds of things that can happen during the course of a battle, during a war. And so I think it's worthwhile to explore the reasons why we find ourselves in the state of unknowing, and why at least a person like myself has to commit himself frequently to a state of agnosticism about issues that are at least potentially determinable, unlike some other issues. And if I'm perfectly honest, I think there are two major culprits here. The first culprit is, frankly speaking, a very familiar one, and that's the internet. The internet has allowed for many, many good things, but also a few not so good things, in the sense that there are so many diverging branches of possibilities that you can explore online, and that often serve as alternative explanations for things, which may or may not be true. Maybe some of them are, maybe some of them are not. And so in the first instance, we are assailed by a surplus of information. And when you have a surplus of information, that forces you to choose. You don't have much of a choice. very, very few individuals are going to take the time to explore every possible source of information on every possible subject matter. To the extent they pursue information at all, they typically find something and they settle on it and they pursue it and leave it at that. And there are a number of reasons for this. Part of the reason is, just as I've alluded to prior, the simple fact that we have a limited capacity to learn things, we have a limited capacity to know things, and you will understandably have to cut corners and cut to the chase on certain things, and of course focus on one or two possible explanations above others. But what animates that, and this is kind of the second point, and probably the more salient point, is that when we choose to isolate certain sources of information and separate them from others, the reason, and this is only a tendency, but oftentimes the reason is because one source of information is associated and affiliated with one particular faction, political, cultural, religious, and another with another. And effectively what we're talking about then is nothing other than tribalism. That we all like our teams, and we want to see our teams win, so if information is being presented, we're much more likely to reject the information from the team that we are not affiliated with and that we even regard in a hostile manner. And so you have the sheer superfluity of information, and then you have the teams that people align themselves with. And that comes together and creates this confluence of conflict and problems. And it suffers from all the things that human beings typically suffer from. Various cognitive biases, above all, observation bias. Because if you spent all your time looking at information source X, and you're disinclined to look at information source Y, even if there might be some truth or even a lot of truth in information source Y, you're never ever going to get to know that. And so you're going to draw conclusions solely on information source X. And I think this describes rather well the conundrum we find ourselves in the most general sense, in the previous year as well as this forthcoming year, in that we're all part of some faction loosely, and we all have certain preferences. And we lean on those preferences and lean towards pursuing certain sources of information that tend to conform to the teams that we believe ourselves to be on. And it's my rather vague prediction that this phenomenon that I've been describing is only going to get worse in 2021. I don't think we're going to see a marked improvement. I think we're going to see more factionalism, more sources of information, and an ever greater fog of unknowing, an ever greater cloud of ignorance, and we're going to be less inclined than ever to try to figure out things as objectively as possible because we're always being led by our biases, but the internet amplifies that 1,000-fold. And the factionalism and the desire to support our respective teams and score points with our respective teams will only amplify that going forward. And frankly speaking, many of us simply don't know what to believe anymore, and justifiably, because everyone has a particular interest and they're going to spin it the way they want to spin it. So who really knows at the end of the day? And so we're swimming in a sea of ignorance, but I don't see any life vest being tossed to us. I think we're going to have to stay perpetually afloat and hope at some point in time that the fates favor us and we eventually are blown or drift to shore. But going forward, I'm not particularly optimistic about this year, so I'll check you out later. Do please leave a like if you can, share the video, hit the bell icon to be informed of the forthcoming videos. As always, if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you, and you take care of yourself. Bye-bye. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.